The autumn sun cast long shadows across the familiar red brick facade of Davidson Day School in Charlotte, North Carolina. 20 years had passed, but Stephen Curry could still remember every crack in the sidewalk, every window that had witnessed his journey from a scrawny kid with oversized dreams to one of basketball's greatest legends. As his black SUV pulled into the school parking lot, Stephen felt his heart rate quicken. Not from nerves before a game, but from something deeper. Today wasn't about championships or records. Today was about Mrs. Jennifer Walsh, the fifth-grade teacher who had seen something in him when he was just another kid struggling to find his place. The school had organized a Champions Give Back ceremony, honoring successful alumni who returned to inspire current students. Stephen had agreed months ago, but as he stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his navy blazer, he realized this visit meant more to him than any public appearance he'd ever made. Principal Martinez, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, approached with a warm smile. "Mr. Curry, welcome back to Davidson Day. The students are absolutely thrilled. Some of them have been here since 6 a.m. hoping to catch a glimpse of you." Stephen chuckled, his genuine warmth evident. "Please, call me Stephen. And I think I'm more excited than they are. Is Mrs. Walsh here?" "She wouldn't miss it for the world. She's in her old classroom, room 237. She wanted to surprise you there before the ceremony." Principal Martinez's eyes twinkled with a secret. "She's been talking about this day for weeks." As they walked through the familiar hallways, Stephen's mind drifted back to a particular day in 1998. He was 11, still shorter than most of his classmates, getting picked last for every team, except when teachers assigned groups. His father, Del Curry, was making a name for himself in the NBA, but Stephen felt like he was living in his shadow, struggling to prove he was more than just Del Curry's kid. The hallways buzzed with contained excitement. Students pressed against classroom windows, phones hidden behind textbooks, trying to capture photos. Teachers hushed them gently, but Stephen could see the adults were just as starstruck. "You know," Stephen said to Principal Martinez as they climbed the stairs to the second floor, "Mrs. Walsh probably doesn't remember, but she changed my life in this building." "Oh, she remembers, Principal Fay," Martinez replied with a knowing smile. "She's kept every newspaper clipping, every magazine cover. She has a whole scrapbook dedicated to your achievements. She calls it her 'I Told You So' collection." Stephen stopped walking for a moment, touched by the revelation. In a world where everyone wanted something from him, endorsements, appearances, charity work, the idea that someone had been quietly celebrating his successes without expecting anything in return felt overwhelming. They reached room 237, and Stephen could see through the small window in the door. There she was, Mrs. Jennifer Walsh, now in her early 60s, her brown hair streaked with silver, organizing papers at her desk, just like she had 2 decades ago. She wore a simple blue cardigan and had the same gentle demeanor that had made her every student's favorite teacher. "Take your time," Principal Martinez whispered, stepping back to give him privacy. Stephen knocked gently on the door frame. Mrs. Walsh looked up, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. Her face lit up with the same warm smile that had welcomed him into her classroom every morning when he was 11 years old. "Well, look who decided to visit his old teacher," she said, rising from her chair with arms outstretched. "Come here, Stephen Curry." As she embraced him, this woman who stood barely 5 feet tall, hugging the 6'3" NBA superstar, Stephen felt like that uncertain 11-year-old again. But this time, he was filled with gratitude, instead of doubt. "Mrs. Walsh, you look exactly the same," Stephen said, his voice thick with emotion. "And you're still a terrible liar," she laughed, wiping away a tear. "But look at you. Look at what you've become. I always knew, Stephen. I always knew you were destined for something extraordinary." Stephen pulled back slightly, studying her face. "You really did, didn't you? Even when I couldn't make the varsity team freshman year. Even when everyone said I was too small, too weak. Especially then," Mrs. Walsh interrupted firmly. Do you remember what I told you that day you came to me crying because Coach Peterson said you'd never make it in basketball? Stephen's eyes misted over. You said that sometimes the greatest strength comes in the smallest packages, and that God doesn't make mistakes. And I meant every word. She gestured around the classroom, which looked remarkably similar to how it had 20 years ago. Inspirational posters on the walls, students' artwork, displayed proudly. The same wooden desk where she'd spent countless hours grading papers and planning lessons. This room has seen a lot of dreams, Stephen. But yours was special. You had this fire in your eyes, this determination that couldn't be taught. Stephen walked around the familiar space, running his fingers along the desks. I used to sit right there. He pointed to a desk in the third row. And you used to let me help you organize the sports equipment during lunch break. Because you were too proud to admit you were being bullied during recess, Mrs. Walsh said gently. You thought I didn't notice. But teachers see everything, Stephen. I knew those boys were giving you a hard time about your size, about your father's career, about your dreams. So I gave you a safe space. The weight of her understanding, even after all these years, hit Stephen like a revelation. You knew? Of course I knew. And I also knew that protecting you wasn't the answer. Teaching you to believe in yourself was. She moved to a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. I kept something. She opened the folder to reveal essays, assignments, and projects from Stephen's 5th grade year. But what caught his attention was a handwritten note in his 11-year-old scrawl. My dream, by Stephen Curry. I want to play in the NBA like my dad, but I want to be remembered for more than just basketball. I want to help kids who feel small believe they can be big. Stephen stared at the paper, amazed. I can't believe you kept this. I kept it because even then, at 11 years old, you understood that success wasn't just about personal achievement. It was about lifting others up. Mrs. Walsh closed the folder carefully. That's why I'm not surprised by everything you've accomplished. The 3 NBA championships, the MVP awards, the records, they're wonderful. But what makes me proudest is seeing you become the man who remembers where he came from. A gentle knock interrupted their reunion. Principal Martinez peered in. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but the students are getting restless. Are you ready for the ceremony? Stephen looked at Mrs. Walsh, then back at the principal. Actually, I'd like to make a small change to the program if that's okay. Of course. What do you need? Stephen's mind was racing, formulating a plan that had been brewing since the moment he'd walked into this classroom. I want Mrs. Walsh to introduce me to the students, and I want to make sure she's sitting on the stage during my entire presentation. Mrs. Walsh looked surprised. Oh, Stephen, that's not necessary. This is your day. No, Stephen said firmly, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence that had made him a champion. This is our day. You helped shape who I became, Mrs. Walsh. It's time everyone knew that. As they prepared to leave the classroom and head to the auditorium where 400 students waited, Stephen realized that what he was about to do would be more meaningful than any game-winning shot he'd ever made. Because this wasn't about basketball. This was about honoring the person who had taught him that true champions are made not just by talent, but by the people who believe in them when they can't yet believe in themselves. The hallway filled with excited whispers as they walked toward the auditorium, but Stephen barely noticed. His mind was focused on the surprise he was about to reveal, something that would not only honor Mrs. Walsh, but also teach these students a lesson about gratitude, respect, and never forgetting the people who help us reach our dreams. The Davidson Day School auditorium buzzed with an energy that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. 400 students, ranging from elementary to high school, filled every seat, their excitement barely contained by the teachers stationed throughout the room. Local news crews had set up cameras in the back, having caught wind that Stephen Curry was making a special appearance at his former school. Stephen stood backstage, peering through the curtain at the sea of young faces. Some wore his Golden State Warriors jersey. Others held homemade signs with messages like, "Curry is our hero," and "Splash Brother forever." But what struck him most was seeing Mrs. Walsh sitting in the front row, looking slightly overwhelmed by the attention but smiling proudly. Principal Martinez took the stage, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system. Students, faculty, and honored guests, welcome to a very special edition of our Champions Give Back Assembly. Today, we have the incredible honor of hosting someone who once walked these very halls, sat in these very classrooms, and dreamed big dreams right here at Davidson Day School. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Stephen could hear individual voices shouting his name. He took a deep breath, straightening his blazer one final time. But before we welcome our special guest, Principal Martinez continued, I want to recognize someone who has been shaping champions in this school for over 30 years. Mrs. Jennifer Walsh has taught thousands of students, and today, one of her former pupils wants to show his appreciation in a very special way. Stephen had asked Principal Martinez to say those exact words, setting up what was about to happen. He walked onto the stage, and the auditorium exploded in applause. Students jumped to their feet. Phones appeared despite the no-phones policy, and the energy was electric. Stephen approached the microphone with his characteristic humble smile, raising his hands to quiet the crowd. Thank you so much. Please, sit down. He waited for the noise to settle before continuing. You know, I've played in front of some pretty loud crowds, NBA Finals, Olympics, Madison Square Garden. But I've got to tell you, nothing compares to being back home. More cheers erupted, and Stephen laughed. Okay. I need you to listen up because what I'm about to share with you is more important than any three-pointer I've ever made. The auditorium fell silent. The students sensing something significant was about to happen. 20 years ago, I sat in those seats just like you. I was 11 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and I had the biggest dreams you could imagine. I wanted to play professional basketball, but more than that, I wanted to make a difference in the world. Stephen's voice carried clearly through the room, his sincerity evident in every word. But here's the thing about dreams. They can feel impossible, especially when people tell you they are. I was told I was too small, too weak, that I'd never make it in basketball. There were days I wanted to give up, days when I felt like maybe everyone else was right. A few students nodded, clearly relating to his words. That's when Mrs. Jennifer Walsh changed my life. Stephen turned toward the front row where his former teacher sat, her eyes already glistening with tears. Mrs. Walsh, would you please join me on stage? The auditorium fell silent as Mrs. Walsh, looking surprised despite Stephen's earlier request, made her way to the stage. Stephen extended his hand to help her up the steps, and as she reached the microphone, the students began to applaud. Students of Davidson Day School, Stephen said, his arm around his former teacher's shoulders. I want you to meet the woman who taught me that being small doesn't mean being weak, that having big dreams doesn't make you foolish, and that believing in yourself is the first step to achieving anything. Mrs. Walsh wiped away a tear, clearly emotional but trying to maintain her composure. Mrs. Walsh, Stephen continued, you probably don't remember this, but in October of 1998, I came to your classroom during lunch break, crying because some kids had been teasing me about my size and my basketball dreams. Do you remember what you told me? Mrs. Walsh nodded, her voice slightly shaky as she leaned toward the microphone. I told you that diamonds are formed under pressure, and that sometimes the greatest champions come in unexpected packages. That's right, Stephen said, his voice thick with emotion. But you did more than just give me encouraging words. You gave me a safe space when I needed it most. You let me help you in your classroom during lunch breaks when other kids were making me feel small. You saw potential in me when I couldn't see it in myself. The auditorium was completely silent. Now every person hanging on Stephen's words. You also gave me extra math tutoring when I was struggling, stayed after school to help me with my science project, and wrote a letter of recommendation that helped me get into high school. Stephen turned to face Mrs. Walsh directly. You invested in me when I was just another kid with a dream, and you never asked for anything in return. Stephen reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. Mrs. Walsh, 30 years of teaching at Davidson Day School, inspiring thousands of students, and you've never stopped believing in the power of education and the potential in every child. You've given your life to this school and these students." He handed her the envelope. "This is from my family foundation, and it's our way of saying thank you, not just for what you did for me, but for what you've done for every student who's been lucky enough to learn from you." Mrs. Walsh opened the envelope with trembling hands and gasped audibly. The students leaned forward, trying to see what was inside. "This is a check for $100,000 to be used however you see fit for your classroom, your students, or this school," Stephen announced, and the auditorium erupted in cheers. But Stephen wasn't finished. He raised his hand for quiet again. "But that's not all, Mrs. Walsh. My foundation is also establishing the Jennifer Walsh Excellence in Teaching Scholarship, a $10,000 annual scholarship that will go to a graduating senior from Davidson Day School who plans to pursue education as a career, ensuring that your legacy of inspiring and teaching continues for generations to come." Mrs. Walsh broke down in tears, covering her face with her hands. Stephen gently guided her to the microphone. I don't know what to say," she managed through her tears. "Stephen, this is too much. I was just doing my job." "No," Stephen said firmly, his own voice breaking slightly. "You weren't just doing your job. You were changing lives. You were building champions. And every student in this auditorium needs to understand something very important." He turned to address the students directly. "Success isn't just about individual achievement. It's about remembering the people who helped you get there and finding ways to honor them. Mrs. Walsh didn't just teach me math and science. She taught me about character, about perseverance, about treating people with kindness, even when they don't treat you the same way." The students were completely captivated, many with tears in their eyes. "So here's what I want you to remember from today," Stephen continued. "Find your Mrs. Walsh. Find that teacher, that coach, that mentor who believes in you. Listen to them, learn from them, and someday, when you're successful, don't forget to come back and say thank you." Mrs. Walsh finally composed herself enough to speak. "Students, what Stephen has done today, this generosity, this kindness, this gratitude, this is why I became a teacher. Not for recognition, not for rewards, but for moments like this when you see that you've helped shape someone who goes on to make the world a better place." She turned to Stephen. "But what makes me proudest isn't your basketball achievements, Stephen. It's seeing the man you've become, humble, generous, and grateful. You've honored not just me today, but every teacher who's ever believed in a student's potential." The auditorium erupted in the loudest applause of the day, with students and faculty giving them a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. As the cheers finally began to die down, Stephen realized that this moment, this opportunity to honor someone who had shaped his life, felt more meaningful than any trophy he'd ever lifted. And judging by the faces in the crowd, he knew that every student in that auditorium had just learned a lesson that would stay with them far longer than any textbook chapter. But what Stephen didn't know was that someone in the crowd was recording everything, and within hours, this moment would touch hearts around the world. Maya Rodriguez, a senior at Davidson Day School, couldn't believe what she was witnessing. Sitting in the third row of the auditorium, she had started recording on her phone the moment Stephen Curry mentioned Mrs. Walsh, thinking her little brother would want to see his favorite basketball player. But as the ceremony unfolded, Maya realized she was capturing something much more significant than a celebrity: appearance. When Stephen handed Mrs. Walsh the $100,000 check and announced the scholarship in her honor, Maya's hands were shaking as she held her phone. Through her screen, she could see Mrs. Walsh, the same teacher who had stayed after school to help Maya with her college applications, who had written recommendation letters for dozens of students, who had never missed a single school play or athletic event in 30 years, breaking down in tears of joy and disbelief after the assembly ended. And Stephen had spent another hour taking photos with students and signing autographs. Maya made a decision that would change everything. She sat in her car in the school parking lot, uploaded the video to TikTok, and typed a simple caption: "This is how you honor the teachers who change your life." Stephen Curry just surprised my teacher with 100K and I can't stop crying. Teachers deserve everything. Stephen Curry, show gratitude. Within 2 hours, the video had 50,000 views. By that evening, it had reached 500,000. By the next morning, it had exploded to over 2 million views, with thousands of comments pouring in from around the world. 3 states away, in her small apartment in Atlanta, former Davidson Day student Jessica Chen was scrolling through social media when she saw the video. Jessica, now 28 and working as a pediatric nurse, immediately recognized Mrs. Walsh's voice even before she saw her face on screen. She had been Mrs. Walsh's student 15 years earlier during a particularly difficult time when her parents were going through a messy divorce. "Oh my God," Jessica whispered to herself, tears streaming down her face as she watched Stephen honor their former teacher. She immediately shared the video with her own caption. "Mrs. Walsh saved my life when I was 13. She kept me after school not for detention, but to make sure I had someone to talk to when home was chaos. She drove me to counseling appointments when my parents couldn't. Teachers like her are angels." Meanwhile, in Charlotte, local news producer Amanda Kim was monitoring social media for trending stories when she noticed the Davidson Day video appearing across multiple platforms. She immediately recognized the news value, not just because of Stephen Curry's celebrity status, but because of the genuine emotion and the powerful message about gratitude and giving back. By Tuesday morning, Amanda had convinced her news director to run a follow-up story. She arrived at Davidson Day school with her camera crew, hoping to interview Mrs. Walsh and get her reaction to the overnight viral sensation. "I don't understand all this internet stuff," Mrs. Walsh admitted, as she sat in her classroom, looking overwhelmed by the attention. "I've had reporters calling me since 6 a.m., and my principal says there are news vans outside the school." Amanda smiled gently. "Mrs. Walsh, your story with Stephen Curry has touched millions of people. The video has been viewed over 5 million times, and people from around the world are sharing their own stories about teachers who changed their lives." Mrs. Walsh shook her head in amazement. "All I did was my job. I saw a child who needed encouragement, and I gave it to him. Any teacher would have done the same." "But that's exactly why people are so moved," Amanda explained. "In a world where we often focus on the negative, seeing someone succeed and then return to honor the person who helped them, it gives people hope." As Amanda conducted the interview, neither she nor Mrs. Walsh knew that 200 miles away in Los Angeles, Ellen DeGeneres was watching the viral video in her production office, already planning how to get Stephen and Mrs. Walsh on her show. Back in the Bay Area, Stephen was having dinner with his wife Aisha when his phone started buzzing incessantly. Social media notifications, text messages from friends, calls from his publicist, everyone wanted to talk about the Davidson Day video. "Babe, you need to see this," Aisha said, showing him her Instagram feed. "The video from your school visit yesterday is everywhere. People are calling it the most heartwarming thing they've seen all year." Stephen watched the video that Maya had captured, seeing himself and Mrs. Walsh from the audience's perspective. What struck him most were the comments. Thousands upon thousands of people sharing their own stories about teachers who had impacted their lives. One comment read, "I'm 45 years old and I just called my third-grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, to say thank you because of this video. Teachers deserve so much more recognition." Another said, "This made me decide to become a teacher. If I can impact even one child's life like Mrs. Walsh did, it will all be worth it." A particularly moving comment came from a current teacher. "I've been teaching for 20 years and was thinking about quitting because I felt unappreciated. This video reminded me why I fell in love with teaching in the first place. Thank you, Stephen, for showing the world what we do matters." Stephen's publicist called within minutes. "Stephen, we need to talk about the response to your school visit. This video is bigger than anything we could have planned." Ellen's people called. "The Today Show wants an interview, and there's already a hashtag trending. That's your thank a teacher." But it was a text message from his father, Del Curry, that meant the most. "Son, I'm proud of the basketball player you became. but I'm even prouder of the man you are. What you did for Mrs. Walsh reminds me why your mother and I always taught you to remember where you came from. This is your greatest assist ever." By Wednesday, the story had been picked up by major news outlets across the country. CNN ran a segment about the importance of recognizing educators, using Stephen's gesture as a launching point for a broader conversation about teacher appreciation. The Today Show featured Mrs. Walsh via video call, giving her a platform to talk about her 3 decades in education. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Dr. Robert Martinez, the Secretary of Education, issued a statement. "Stephen Curry has done something remarkable. He's reminded our entire nation of the profound impact that dedicated educators have on their students' lives. Mrs. Walsh represents thousands of teachers across America who go above and beyond every single day. We should all follow Mr. Curry's example and find ways to honor the educators who shaped us." Back at Davidson Day School, Mrs. Walsh found herself at the center of a movement she never could have imagined. Teachers from around the country were reaching out, sharing their own stories of students who had made them proud. Parents were posting videos of their children thanking their current teachers. Schools were organizing special recognition ceremonies for their faculty. "I keep thinking this is all a dream," Mrs. Walsh confided to Principal Martinez as they watched the school's phone ring constantly with interview requests. "I've been teaching for 30 years, and I've always believed that the real reward was seeing my students succeed. I never expected this." Principal Martinez smiled. "Jennifer, what Stephen did was beautiful. But what's happening now? This movement of gratitude and recognition for teachers? That's your legacy multiplied. You didn't just impact Stephen Curry. You impacted him in a way that's now touching millions of people." As the week progressed, the Fraude Thank a Teacher movement continued to grow. Students were making videos for their current and former teachers. Adults were reaching out to educators from their past. School districts were implementing new teacher recognition programs. But for Stephen, the most gratifying part wasn't the viral fame or the positive publicity. It was a handwritten letter he received from Mrs. Walsh 3 days after the ceremony. "Dear Stephen, I've been trying to find the words to thank you for what you've done, not just for me, but for teachers everywhere. In 30 years of teaching, I've received many thank you notes from students, but nothing could have prepared me for the magnitude of your gratitude. You've reminded the world that teaching is about more than just curriculum. It's about believing in potential, nurturing dreams, and sometimes being the one person who sees greatness when no one else does. What makes me proudest isn't the money or the recognition, but knowing that the little boy who used to help me organize sports equipment grew up to be a man who understands the power of saying thank you. You've started something beautiful, Stephen. Teachers across the world are feeling appreciated in ways they haven't in years. That's a championship worth celebrating. With love and pride, Mrs. Walsh." As Stephen folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, he realized that what had started as a simple desire to thank his former teacher had become something much larger. A reminder to an entire world about the importance of gratitude, recognition, and never forgetting the people who help us become who we're meant to be. But the story was far from over. The viral video had caught the attention of someone who could amplify the message even further, and Stephen was about to receive a phone call that would take Mrs. Walsh's story to an entirely new level. 1 week after the Davidson Day Assembly, Stephen Curry was in his home office reviewing game film when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something told him to answer. "Stephen, this is Oprah Winfrey." Even for someone who had played on the world's biggest stages, hearing those words made Stephen's heart skip a beat. "I hope you don't mind me calling directly," Oprah continued, her warm voice unmistakable. "I got your number from a mutual friend because I had to tell you personally how moved I was by what you did for Mrs. Walsh. That video has been shared with me by at least 50 people, and I've watched it probably 20 times. Stephen sat down, still processing that Oprah Winfrey was calling him about Mrs. Walsh. "Ms. Winfrey, Wow. Thank you so much. What I did was really just a small gesture compared to what Mrs. Walsh gave me. That's exactly why I'm calling, Oprah said. Your humility, your gratitude, and your understanding of how important it is to honor the people who shape us. That's the kind of story the world needs to hear. I want to feature you and Mrs. Walsh on Super Soul Sunday. Stephen couldn't believe what he was hearing. Super Soul Sunday was Oprah's most prestigious platform, reserved for conversations about purpose, meaning, and transformative experiences. But more than that, Oprah continued, I want to do something that will create a lasting impact. I want to partner with your foundation to establish teacher recognition programs across the country. Your gesture for Mrs. Walsh shouldn't be a one-time event. It should be the beginning of a movement. 3 weeks later, Stephen and Mrs. Walsh found themselves sitting across from Oprah in her beautiful Santa Barbara studio. Mrs. Walsh, who had never been on television before, was nervous but radiant in a new navy blue dress that her daughter had insisted she buy for the occasion. Mrs. Walsh, Oprah began, her eyes already glistening with emotion. When you were teaching that 11-year-old boy named Stephen Curry, did you have any idea you were shaping someone who would one day impact millions of people? Mrs. Walsh smiled softly. Oprah, I've taught thousands of children over 30 years, and I can honestly say I saw something special in each one of them. Stephen was no different in that regard. He had this light in his eyes, this determination that couldn't be extinguished. What makes him unique isn't his talent, it's his heart. Stephen reached over and squeezed his former teacher's hand. What Mrs. Walsh is too humble to say is that she saved me during one of the most difficult periods of my life. I was being bullied, I was doubting myself, and I was ready to give up on my dreams. She didn't just believe in me. She taught me to believe in myself. Oprah leaned forward. Tell me about that moment when you decided to honor her so publicly. Honestly, it wasn't planned, Stephen admitted. When I walked back into her classroom and saw her sitting at that same desk, grading papers with the same care she had 20 years ago, I was overwhelmed with gratitude. Here was this woman who had given her entire career to children, who had impacted thousands of lives, and she was still there, still believing in students, still making a difference. I realized that if I could make one shot that would be seen around the world, it should be the shot that honors someone like her. Mrs. Walsh wiped away a tear. What Stephen did changed my life, but what's happened since has been even more incredible. I've received over $5,000, letters and emails from people around the world, former students thanking their teachers, current students appreciating their educators, and teachers feeling valued in ways they haven't in years. Oprah nodded knowingly. That's the power of gratitude. When we honor one person authentically, it gives permission for everyone else to do the same. Stephen, tell me about what you and Mrs. Walsh are planning to do together. Stephen's face lit up with excitement. We're launching the Walsh Curry Foundation for Educational Excellence. The goal is to identify teachers across the country who are making extraordinary impacts in their communities and provide them with both financial support and public recognition. We want to make sure that Mrs. Walsh's story isn't unique. We want it to be one of thousands. We're starting with 50 teachers in the first year, Mrs. Walsh added, her voice gaining strength as she talked about the project. Each will receive $25,000 for their classroom or personal use, plus a weekend retreat where they can connect with other exceptional educators. But more importantly, their stories will be shared nationally, because teachers need to know that their work matters and that people notice their dedication. Oprah smiled broadly. And I'm thrilled to announce that OWN Network will be partnering with your foundation to produce a documentary series called The Teachers Who Changed Everything, featuring some of these remarkable educators and the students whose lives they've transformed. After the interview aired, the response was overwhelming. The Walsh Curry Foundation received over $2 million in donations within the first month. Teachers across the country began nominating their colleagues for recognition. School districts started implementing their own teacher appreciation programs modeled after Stephen's gesture to Mrs. Walsh. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came 6 months later, during the Foundation's first annual gala in Charlotte, Stephen stood on stage, looking out at an audience of 500 teachers, students, parents, and community leaders who had gathered to celebrate educational excellence. "Mrs. Walsh," Stephen said, gesturing to his former teacher who sat at the head table, looking elegant and proud. "When you let that scared 11-year-old boy help you organize sports equipment during lunch breaks, you probably thought you were just giving him a safe space for 30 minutes. You had no idea you were teaching him a lesson about kindness, about seeing potential in others, and about the responsibility that comes with success." Mrs. Walsh stood and waved to the crowd, receiving a thunderous standing ovation. "Tonight, we're honoring 50 incredible teachers from across the United States," Stephen continued. "But really, we're honoring the profession that shapes every other profession. We're celebrating the people who see greatness before it exists and nurture it until it blooms." As Stephen announced each teacher's name and shared their story, the audience was moved to tears repeatedly. There was Ms. Rodriguez from Phoenix, who had spent her own money to create a reading program for struggling students. Mr. Johnson from Detroit, who had turned an abandoned lot into a school garden where kids learned about science, nutrition, and responsibility. Mrs. Kim from Seattle, who had learned sign language so she could better communicate with a deaf student in her class. Each teacher received the same recognition Stephen had given Mrs. Walsh: financial support, public acknowledgement, and, most importantly, the message that their work mattered. During the dinner, Stephen found himself sitting next to Marcus Williams, a 16-year-old from Atlanta whose teacher, Mr. Davis, was being honored that night. "Mr. Curry," Marcus said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for what you did for Mrs. Walsh, because it made me realize I needed to thank Mr. Davis. He's been staying after school to tutor me in math for 2 years, and I never really told him how much it meant to me." Stephen smiled. "Did you tell him tonight?" "I did, and I'm going to keep telling him, because I watched that video of you and Mrs. Walsh probably 100 times, and I realized that saying thank you isn't just nice, it's necessary." As the evening wound down, Stephen and Mrs. Walsh found themselves alone on the hotel's balcony, looking out at the Charlotte skyline. "You know what's funny?" Mrs. Walsh said, her voice reflective. "I spent 30 years trying to teach children about the importance of kindness, gratitude, and recognizing others' contributions. But you ended up teaching me that lesson in the most beautiful way possible." Stephen shook his head. "Mrs. Walsh, you taught me everything I needed to know about those values. I just finally got old enough to understand the lesson." "What do you think will happen with all of this?" she asked, gesturing toward the hotel where teachers from across the country were celebrating and connecting with one another. Stephen thought for a moment. "I think we're going to change how this country thinks about teachers. I think kids are going to grow up understanding that their teachers are heroes, not just because we told them so, but because they saw it demonstrated. And I think some of those kids are going to become teachers themselves, inspired by the recognition and respect they saw their educators receive." Mrs. Walsh smiled. "That would be the greatest legacy of all." 2 years later, the Walsh-Curry Foundation had honored over 200 teachers, and the Wired Thank a Teacher movement had become a permanent part of American culture. Schools across the country had implemented annual teacher recognition programs. The documentary series had won an Emmy, and most importantly, teaching applications at education schools had increased by 23% nationally, with many applicants citing Stephen's tribute to Mrs. Walsh as their inspiration. But for Stephen, the most meaningful measure of success came in the form of a letter from Maya Rodriguez, the Davidson Day student who had originally recorded the viral video. Maya, now a college freshman studying education, wrote, "Mr. Curry, I wanted you to know that I'm going to be a teacher because of what I witnessed that day in our auditorium. Seeing how you honored Mrs. Walsh made me realize that teaching isn't just a job. It's a calling to shape the future. I want to be someone's Mrs. Walsh someday. I want to believe in a child when they can't believe in themselves."